The crimson sunset painted the dusty streets of Pioche, Nevada territory, in hues of amber and gold as Penelope Lawson stepped off the stagecoach, her arrival marked by whispers that followed her like shadows. The small mining town nestled in the rugged mountains of eastern Nevada had been her last hope, a place where perhaps her reputation wouldn't precede her. But as the townsfolk gathered to gawk at the newcomer, she realized her hope had been in vain. "That's her," came a hushed voice. The Lawson woman from Tucson. Penelope kept her chin high as she collected her single trunk from the coachman, her emerald eyes fixed straight ahead. At 24, she had already endured more tragedy than most faced in a lifetime, and the weight of it showed not in her posture, which remained proud, but in the wariness that shadowed her gaze. "They say every man who's ever loved her has met an untimely end," another voice murmured, not quite quietly enough. The year was 1873, and superstition still ran as deep as the silver veins that had put Pioche on the map. Penelope had arrived hoping to start anew as a schoolteacher, answering an advertisement she'd spotted in a Sacramento newspaper. The town had grown rapidly since the silver strike of '69, and families with children had followed the miners, creating the need for education. Miss Lawson. A thin man with spectacles approached, his expression a mix of curiosity and trepidation. "I'm Edwin Barker, chairman of the school board. We weren't expecting you until next week." "The stagecoach routes changed," she replied, her voice calm despite the tension surrounding her. "I hope it's not an inconvenience." "No, no," he assured her, though his eyes darted nervously to the crowd. "Your accommodations at the boarding house should be ready. Mrs. Wilson runs a respectable establishment." As Barker led her down the main street, Penelope could feel the stares burning into her back. She had hoped the stories wouldn't follow her here, 300 miles from Tucson, but bad news traveled fast in the West, especially the kind that made for good gossip over whiskey. Preston O'Malley leaned against the hitching post outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, watching the scene unfold with interest. At 32, he had long since learned to form his own opinions about people rather than rely on hearsay. The new schoolteacher looked nothing like the harbinger of death the whispers painted her to be, just a woman with too much dignity for the burden she carried. "That's her, Pries," said Jasper Wilson, the blacksmith, joining him at the rail. "The widow-maker from Arizona. They say her fiancé was killed the night before their wedding. Then she moved to Tucson, and 2 more suitors met similar fates. One shot in a robbery, another thrown from his horse. The third one—" "I don't recall asking for her life story," Preston interrupted, pushing his hat back with one thumb. His light brown hair caught the last rays of the setting sun. "Just thought you should know," Jasper continued, being the only eligible bachelor in town who might have an interest in more book learning. Preston snorted. "I manage the largest cattle operation this side of the Meadow Valley Wash. Don't need much book learning for that." "Just saying," Jasper persisted. "Stay clear of that one. She's cursed, or worse. Bad luck follows her like vultures on a dying steer." Preston watched as Barker escorted Miss Lawson toward the boarding house at the end of the street. There was something in the way she carried herself, shoulders back, head high despite the weight of judgment around her, that spoke of a strength he couldn't help but admire. "Might be the only curse she has is people spreading tales about her," Preston replied, straightening up from the post. "Now I've got cattle to tend to." Jasper grabbed his arm. "I'm serious, Pries. 3 men dead, all of them courting her. That ain't coincidence." Preston shook off his friend's hand. "Then I'll take my chances." He hadn't meant it as a declaration of intent, merely as a rebuff to superstition. But the words hung in the air like a promise as he mounted his chestnut mare and headed toward the O'Malley ranch outside of town. Penelope spent her first evening in Pioche arranging her modest room at Mrs. Wilson's boarding house. The landlady, a tight-lipped woman with iron-gray hair, had shown her to the room with minimal conversation, which suited Penelope fine. It was clear Mrs. Wilson had heard the rumors. Her eyes had narrowed when Penelope introduced herself, and she'd maintained a careful distance as if proximity alone might bring calamity. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a writing desk beneath the window that overlooked the back garden. Penelope unpacked her few belongings: clothes, books, and a small silver-framed photograph of her parents, both long deceased. As she placed the frame on the bedside table, she caught her reflection in the mirror above the washstand. The face that looked back at her seemed too young to have endured so much loss. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and her green eyes held a resolve that had kept her moving forward when grief might have consumed a weaker spirit. "You will not break," she whispered to her reflection, a mantra she had repeated since the death of her last suitor, Thomas, 8 months ago. She had loved him deeply, and his passing thrown from his horse during a sudden thunderstorm had nearly destroyed her. It was after his funeral that the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. The coincidences were too many, people said. 3 men, all connected to her, all dead within 2 years. A knock at her door startled her from her reverie. She opened it to find a young girl, perhaps 16, with a dinner tray. "Ma sent this up," the girl said, peering at Penelope with undisguised curiosity. "Said you might want to eat in your room tonight." "Thank you," Penelope replied, accepting the tray. "You must be Mrs. Wilson's daughter." "I'm Caroline," the girl confirmed. "You're really the new school teacher." "I am. I look forward to meeting my students." Caroline shifted from one foot to the other. "Some of the mothers are saying they won't send their children to you." Penelope's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. "Perhaps they'll change their minds when they see that I'm quite ordinary and not at all dangerous." "Is it true what they say about the men who courted you, Caroline?" Mrs. Wilson's sharp voice came from downstairs. "Stop bothering Miss Lawson and come help with the dishes." The girl gave an apologetic smile and hurried away, leaving Penelope alone with her thoughts and a meal she suddenly had no appetite for. Morning brought no reprieve from the whispers. As Penelope made her way to the schoolhouse for the first time, she could see mothers pulling their children closer as she passed, men tipping their hats with a mixture of wariness and morbid fascination. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building on the edge of town, newly constructed from pine lumber that still smelled of resin. Inside, benches and desks were arranged in neat rows. A pot-bellied stove stood in one corner, and a teacher's desk faced the room from the front. Penelope had arrived early to prepare for her first day, but as the hour approached when children should begin arriving, the building remained empty. She stood at the door, watching the street, her heart sinking with each passing minute. Finally, just as she was about to give up hope, she saw a small group approaching Edwin Barker, accompanied by 3 children and their mothers who looked nervous but determined. "Miss Lawson," Barker greeted her, his voice overly cheerful. "I've brought you some students, Mrs. Cooper's twins, William and James, and Mrs. Hernandez's daughter, Lucia. They're eager to begin their education." The children, ranging in age from about 7 to 10, looked more curious than eager, but Penelope smiled warmly at them. "I'm delighted to meet you all," she said, bending slightly to address the children at eye level. "Shall we go inside and get acquainted?" As the children filed in, one of the mothers, Mrs. Cooper, Penelope presumed approached her with a stiff smile. "Miss Lawson, we're trusting you with our children. I hope you understand the concern some of us have." "I assure you, Mrs. Cooper, Your children are perfectly safe with me. I'm simply a teacher who wants to share knowledge." The woman nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "We'll see how the week goes." It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was a start. 3 students were better than none, and perhaps, Penelope thought with cautious optimism, others would join once the town saw that no disaster befell these first brave families. By noon, Penelope had fallen into the familiar rhythm of teaching, her spirits lifting as the children responded to her lessons with enthusiasm. She had just begun explaining the basics of geography when the schoolhouse door opened, drawing all eyes to the tall figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight. "Apologies for the interruption," came a deep voice as the man stepped inside, removing his hat to reveal light brown hair and eyes the color of whiskey. "I've brought some books for your classroom, Miss Lawson." Penelope recognized him as the cowboy who had been watching her arrival the previous day, one of the few who hadn't looked at her with outright suspicion. "That's very kind, Mr. O'Malley. Preston O'Malley." He set a small stack of books on her desk. "Heard you might be short on materials, what with the school being new and all." "Mr. O'Malley," young Lucia exclaimed. "He owns the big ranch with all the horses." Preston grinned at the girl. "That's right, Lucia. How's your pa doing? I heard he was looking for work." "Much better since you hired him last month, sir. He says you're a fair boss." "Glad to hear it." His eyes returned to Penelope. "These are just some old books from my personal collection. Thought they might be useful." Penelope examined the offerings, several well-worn volumes of history, literature, and mathematics. "This is very thoughtful, Mr. O'Malley. We're most grateful." She glanced at the children. "Aren't we, class?" "Yes, Miss Lawson," they chorused. Preston nodded, replacing his hat. "Just doing my part for education." "Good day to you, Miss Lawson. Children." As he turned to leave, Penelope found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "Mr. O'Malley, perhaps you'd like to stay for our geography lesson. The children are learning about the territories." He paused, seeming surprised by the invitation. "I'm afraid my knowledge of geography comes mostly from riding across it, not studying maps." "Sometimes that's the best way to learn," she replied. "If you have the time, we'd welcome your perspective." He hesitated, then smiled. "Well, I suppose the ranch can spare me for another half-hour." The children scooted eagerly to make room as Preston settled onto one of the benches, his long legs looking comically oversized in the small space. For the next 30 minutes, he captivated them with stories of riding through mountain passes, crossing rivers during spring floods, and navigating by stars when trails disappeared. Penelope found herself as engaged as her students, drawn to the vivid way he described the landscape. Here was a man who truly loved the land he worked, who saw beauty in the harsh terrain others might find forbidding. When the lesson concluded, the children begged for more stories, but Preston insisted he had to return to his ranch. As he stood to leave, his eyes met Penelope's, and something passed between them, a moment of connection neither had expected. "Perhaps you'll visit again, Mr. O'Malley," she said. "The children clearly enjoyed your contribution." "Perhaps I will, Miss Lawson." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving the schoolroom feeling somehow emptier than before. That evening, as Penelope walked back to the boarding house, she was intercepted by Edwin Barker, whose pinched expression suggested he was not bringing good news. "Miss Lawson, there's been talk in town," he began, falling into step beside her. "There seems to be a great deal of talk in Pioche," she replied evenly. "Yes, well, this concerns Mr. O'Malley's visit to your classroom today." She stopped walking. "Mr. O'Malley kindly donated books and shared his knowledge with the students. I fail to see how that could be cause for concern." Barker cleared his throat. "The concern, Miss Lawson, is that you might be encouraging his attentions. I encouraged his contribution to the children's education, she corrected, her voice cooling. Nothing more. Of course, Barker backpedaled. It's just that, given your history, my history. Her voice was dangerously quiet now. What exactly do you know of my history, Mr. Barker? He had the grace to look uncomfortable. Only what's been said. That men who develop feelings for you tend to meet unfortunate ends. Penelope's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her composure. I have lost people I cared deeply for, Mr. Barker. It was painful and traumatic, and I would appreciate if the good people of Pioche would not use my personal tragedies as entertainment. Now, if there are concerns about my teaching abilities, I am happy to address those. Otherwise, I bid you good evening. She continued walking, leaving Barker standing in the street. Her heart was pounding, and she fought to control the trembling in her hands. It had been naive to think she could outrun the rumors, that she could start fresh in Pioche or anywhere else. Perhaps she should resign before she became too attached to the children, before the townspeople's suspicions made her position untenable. She could move on to another town, perhaps farther north or east, where the shadows of her past might not reach. But as she rounded the corner to the boarding house, she nearly collided with Preston O'Malley, who was just mounting his horse. "Miss Lawson," he said, seeming surprised but pleased to see her. "I was just leaving a message for you with Mrs. Wilson." A message? An invitation, actually. The ranch is hosting a barbecue this Sunday after church. Nothing formal, just neighbors getting together. I thought you might like to come, meet some of the families in a more social setting. She stared at him, puzzled by his persistence when he surely must have heard the whispers. "That's very kind, but I'm not sure it would be wise." Because of the talk, he dismounted, bringing himself closer to her level. Up close, she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the lines at their corners that suggested he smiled often. "Miss Lawson, I don't put much stock in gossip." "Perhaps you should in this case," she said quietly. "The things they say about me. I prefer to form my own opinions." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "The way I see it, a woman who cares enough to teach other people's children when they've been less than welcoming deserves the benefit of the doubt." Penelope felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a dangerous flicker of hope she quickly tried to extinguish. "Mr. O'Malley, Preston, please." "Preston, then. I appreciate your kindness, truly, but you should know that the rumors, they're not entirely without basis. I have experienced loss, significant loss, and those losses have coincidentally involved men who were close to me." "Coincidence being the operative word," he replied. "Unless you're confessing to something more sinister." Despite herself, she smiled at his teasing tone. "No, nothing sinister, just extraordinarily bad luck." "Well then, I'll take my chances." He said it simply, as if he were commenting on the weather, but the echo of his words from the previous day hung between them. "The barbecue starts at noon. I'd be honored if you'd attend." Before she could formulate a response, he tipped his hat, remounted his horse, and rode away, leaving her with a decision to make and a heart that, against all reason, had begun to hope again. The following days passed in a blur of teaching and avoiding the stares of townspeople. To Penelope's surprise and cautious delight, her class had grown to 7 students by Friday, as word spread among the families that the new teacher was competent, and that no disasters had befallen the first brave students. Sunday morning found her standing before her small mirror, considering what to wear to the O'Malley barbecue. She had decided to accept the invitation, partly from a desire to establish herself in the community, and partly, though she was reluctant to admit it, because of Preston himself. There was something about his straightforward manner and refusal to judge her based on rumor that drew her to him, despite her better judgment. She finally settled on a light blue dress with white trim, modest but more festive than her usual teaching attire. She pinned her auburn hair into a softer style than her usual severe knot, allowing a few curls to frame her face. Mrs. Wilson raised her eyebrows when Penelope came downstairs. "You look nice, Miss Lawson. Special occasion." "Mr. O'Malley has invited me to a barbecue at his ranch," Penelope replied, bracing for disapproval. To her surprise, Mrs. Wilson's expression softened slightly. "Preston O'Malley is a good man. Built that ranch from nothing after his father passed, treats his workers fair." She hesitated, then added, "But he's well liked in town. People would hate to see anything happen to him." The implicit warning wasn't lost on Penelope. "I assure you, Mrs. Wilson, I have no intention of bringing harm to Mr. O'Malley or anyone else." The older woman studied her for a long moment. "No, I don't suppose you do. But intention and outcome aren't always the same, are they?" With that cryptic remark, she returned to her kitchen, leaving Penelope to ponder her words as she set out for the O'Malley ranch on foot, having arranged earlier for a ride from Edwin Barker and his wife. The O'Malley ranch lay about 3 miles outside of Pioche, a sprawling property nestled in a valley with mountains rising dramatically behind it. As the Barker's wagon approached, Penelope could see a large main house made of stone and timber, several outbuildings and corrals filled with horses. Men were tending a fire pit where a whole steer turned slowly on a spit, filling the air with a mouth-watering aroma. A crowd had already gathered ranch hands, townspeople, and neighboring ranchers with their families. Penelope felt a flutter of anxiety as the wagon pulled up, knowing that her presence might not be welcomed by all. Preston spotted them immediately, striding over to help Mrs. Barker down from the wagon before turning to offer his hand to Penelope. His smile was warm, genuine, and made her heart perform an unexpected somersault in her chest. "Miss Lawson, I'm glad you came," he said, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Let me show you around." As he led her through the gathering, introducing her to his workers and neighbors, Penelope was acutely aware of the mixed reactions, some welcoming, others wary or openly hostile. Preston seemed oblivious to the tension, or perhaps he simply chose to ignore it, keeping up a steady stream of conversation about the ranch and its history. "My father started with just 20 acres and a dozen head of cattle," he explained as they walked past a corral where several impressive horses watched them curiously. By the time he passed in '68, it had grown to 500 acres. Now we're pushing 2,000. "That's remarkable," Penelope said sincerely. "You must be very proud. It's been hard work, but worth it." He glanced at her. "What about you? What brought you to teaching?" "My father was a professor before he died. He believed education was the greatest gift one could give or receive." She smiled at the memory. "I was fortunate he educated me far beyond what most girls receive. When he and my mother died of influenza when I was 18, teaching seemed the natural path." "And what brought you to Pioche?" He asked the question casually, but they both knew what lay beneath it. Penelope took a deep breath. "A fresh start. My last position was in Tucson, but after my fiancé died, it became difficult to remain. Because of the gossip, partly, and partly because everywhere I looked I saw reminders of him." She hadn't spoken of Thomas to anyone since leaving Arizona, and the words felt foreign on her tongue. "It's difficult to move forward when the past surrounds you." Preston nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that better than most. After my father died, I considered selling the ranch, starting fresh somewhere the memories weren't so strong. But in the end, I couldn't leave. The good memories outweighed the pain." They had reached a bluff overlooking the entire ranch property, the mountains rising majestically behind them, the valley spreading out below. The view was breathtaking. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Preston said quietly. "When things get overwhelming, I come here to remind myself why it's all worth it." Penelope could see why. The landscape had a wild beauty that spoke to something deep within her, a sense of possibility and freedom she hadn't felt in years. "Thank you for sharing it with me," she said, genuinely moved by the gesture. He turned to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "Miss Lawson, Penelope, I want you to know that I don't believe a word of what they say about you. Loss happens. It's part of life out here, especially. That doesn't make you cursed or dangerous." His words touched a place in her heart that had been closed off for too long. "That's kind of you to say, but you barely know me." "I'm a good judge of character," he replied with a small smile. "Always have been. It's kept me alive in a land where trust is currency and mistakes can be fatal." A shout from below interrupted them. The food was ready, and guests were being called to eat. As they made their way back down to the gathering, Penelope felt lighter somehow, as if sharing even that small part of her story had lessened its weight. The meal was a boisterous affair, with long tables set up under cottonwood trees, plates piled high with barbecued beef, beans, cornbread, and all manner of side dishes brought by the guests. Penelope found herself seated between Preston and an older woman introduced as Martha Jenkins, whose grandson was one of Penelope's new students. "He talks about you constantly," Mrs. Jenkins confided, surprising Penelope. "Says you explain things in a way that makes sense, not like old Mr. Peterson who used to clip him on the ear when he got his sums wrong." "I believe children learn better through encouragement than fear," Penelope replied, pleased by the compliment. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. Timmy's reading has improved more in a week with you than in a month with Peterson." As the meal progressed, Penelope found herself drawn into conversation with other parents and neighbors, many of whom seemed to be reserving judgment rather than accepting the rumors at face value. It was a small victory, but a significant one. After the meal, as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, someone produced a fiddle, and impromptu dancing began in a cleared area near the house. Couples young and old joined in, swinging to lively tunes that echoed off the surrounding hills. Preston appeared at her side, hand extended in invitation. "May I have this dance, Miss Lawson?" She hesitated, all too aware of the eyes that would be upon them. "I'm not sure that's wise." "One dance," he persisted, "to thank you for coming today." Against her better judgment, she placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her to the dancing area. The fiddle struck up a waltz, and Preston's arm slipped around her waist, holding her at a respectful distance as they began to move in time to the music. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer for a man who spent his days on horseback, leading her confidently through the steps. Penelope found herself relaxing into the dance, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement and music and the warm strength of his hand at her back. "You dance beautifully," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Where did a school teacher learn to waltz like this?" "My father insisted I have a complete education," she replied with a small smile. "That included dance lessons, though I haven't had much opportunity to practice in recent years." "Well, you haven't lost your touch." His eyes held hers, warm and appreciative in a way that made her pulse quicken. "You know, there's a social dance in town next weekend. The Miners' Association hosts it monthly. Are you inviting me, Mr. O'Malley? If I were, would you accept?" She should say no. Every instinct for self-preservation urged caution, distance. But something stronger, something that had been dormant for too long, pushed her toward a different answer. "I might," she said finally, "if asked properly. His smile broadened. "Then, Miss Lawson, would you do me the honor of accompanying me to the social dance next Saturday evening?" Before she could respond, a commotion erupted at the edge of the gathering. A group of men had arrived on horseback, clearly already deep in their cups, led by a rough-looking character with a shock of red hair and a scar bisecting one eyebrow. "Well, if it ain't the high and mighty O'Malley, hosting his fancy party," the red-haired man called out, his voice slurring slightly. "Didn't get our invitation, so we thought we'd just stop by." Preston's expression hardened as he stopped dancing, though he kept a protective hand at Penelope's elbow. "You weren't invited for a reason, Harley. Last time you were here, you started a fight that cost me 2 good hands who quit rather than work alongside you." "That's so." Harley dismounted unsteadily, his companions following suit. "Seems to me you're just too good for the likes of us these days. Got yourself a big ranch, think you're better than the men who work the mines." "I think you've had too much to drink," Preston replied evenly. "Why don't you and your friends head back to town before this gets unpleasant?" Harley's bloodshot eyes fixed on Penelope. Well, if it ain't the curse herself. Heard about you, schoolmarm. Heard your bad luck for any man fool enough to court you." Penelope stiffened but remained silent, unwilling to dignify the taunt with a response. "You leave her out of this, Harley," Preston warned, his tone dropping to something dangerous. "Your quarrel, if you have one, is with me." "Oh, I got no quarrel," Harley replied with a nasty grin. "Just offering friendly advice. They say she's killed 3 men already. You aiming to be number 4, O'Malley." Preston moved so quickly that Penelope barely registered it before he had Harley by the collar, lifting the smaller man nearly off his feet. "Apologize to the lady," he growled. Harley's friends tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but Preston's ranch hands had already closed ranks behind him, creating a solid wall of support. "Easy now," Harley choked out, his bravado faltering in the face of Preston's anger. "Just repeating what I heard is all." "Apologize," Preston repeated, "or the only thing you'll be hearing is the sound of your own teeth hitting the dirt." "Sorry, madam," Harley managed, his face reddening from Preston's grip. "Spoke out of turn." Preston released him with a slight shove. "Now take your friends and get off my property. You're not welcome here." For a moment, it seemed Harley might press the issue, but a glance at the grim faces of the ranch hands convinced him otherwise. With a muttered curse, he remounted his horse, and the group departed in a cloud of dust and resentment. The festive atmosphere had been dampened by the confrontation. Guests began making their goodbyes, thanking Preston for his hospitality while casting curious glances at Penelope, who stood slightly apart, struggling to regain her composure. When most had departed, Preston approached her, concern evident in his expression. "I'm sorry about that. Harley Jensen is a troublemaker at the best of times, and whiskey makes him worse." "It's not your fault," she said quietly, "but perhaps you see now why I hesitated to accept your invitation to dance. My presence here has caused you embarrassment." "No," he said firmly. "Harley's behavior caused embarrassment. You have nothing to apologize for." She shook her head, not meeting his eyes. "This is what happens, Preston. The rumors follow me, and anyone associated with me becomes tainted by them. It's why I've kept to myself for so long." "And is that the life you want?" he challenged gently. "Always alone, always afraid to connect with others for fear of what might be said." The question struck at the heart of the loneliness she had lived with for too long. "Of course not, but I've learned to be practical. 3 men I cared for died. Coincidence or not, it makes people afraid." "I'm not afraid," Preston said simply. She finally looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt or reservation. Finding none, she felt something shift inside her, a wall beginning to crumble. "You should be," she whispered. "I am." He took her hand then, his touch gentle but firm. "Fear is a poor compass, Penelope. It leads us away from life, not toward it." In that moment, with the setting sun painting the landscape in gold and his eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, Penelope felt herself standing at a crossroads. Behind her lay safety and solitude, ahead the terrifying possibility of connection and with it, the risk of more pain. "I should go," she said finally, withdrawing her hand. "The Barkers will be looking for me." He nodded, not pressing further. "My offer stands for the social dance next Saturday. Think about it." As she walked away to find the Barkers, Penelope knew she would think of little else in the days to come. The week following the barbecue brought subtle changes to Penelope's standing in Pioche. Word of Preston O'Malley's clear interest in her had spread throughout the small community, and while it didn't eliminate the whispers, it tempered them somewhat. Preston O'Malley was respected, and if he saw something in the cursed schoolteacher worth pursuing, perhaps there was more to her than rumor suggested. By Wednesday, her class had grown to 12 students, with more expected the following week. Edwin Barker seemed cautiously pleased with the development when he visited to observe her teaching methods. "You have a natural gift, Miss Lawson," he admitted as the children filed out for their midday meal. "The children respond well to you." "Thank you, Mr. Barker. I've always believed that every child can learn if approached with patience and respect." He nodded, then cleared his throat awkwardly. "About our conversation last week regarding Mr. O'Malley, I may have overstepped. Your personal affairs are your own business." Penelope recognized the olive branch for what it was. "I understand your concern for both Mr. O'Malley and the school's reputation. I assure you I value both highly." As Barker departed, Penelope found herself smiling. It was a small victory, but it felt significant after weeks of wariness and suspicion. That evening, a knock at her boarding house door revealed Caroline Wilson, the landlady's daughter, holding a small package. "This came for you," the girl said, handing over a brown paper-wrapped parcel. Mr. O'Malley's ranch hand delivered it. Penelope thanked her and retreated to her room to open the unexpected gift. Inside the simple wrapping, she found a book, a well-preserved copy of Wordsworth's poetry, and a note written in a strong, clear hand. "Miss Lawson, found this among my father's books and thought you might enjoy it. Poetry always seems more meaningful when read in beautiful surroundings. Perhaps you might consider reading it on the way to the social dance on Saturday, should you decide to accept my invitation. With respect, Preston O'Malley." Penelope ran her fingers over the embossed cover of the book, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Preston wasn't the first man to court her with books. Thomas had shared her love of literature, but there was something particularly meaningful about this gesture, coming as it did in the face of the town's superstitions. She opened the volume randomly, her eyes falling on a passage that seemed almost prophetic. The best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love. Closing the book, Penelope made her decision. She would go to the dance with Preston O'Malley, rumors and superstitions be damned. Life had taken too much from her already. She would not allow fear to take what little joy remained. Saturday evening arrived with clear skies, and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and pine down from the mountains. Penelope wore her best dress, a deep green that complemented her eyes and hair, and allowed herself the small vanity of a touch of her mother's old perfume at her wrists and throat. Mrs. Wilson actually smiled when she came downstairs, a rare enough occurrence that Penelope was momentarily taken aback. "You look lovely, Miss Lawson," the older woman said, adjusting the collar of Penelope's dress with motherly precision. "Mr. O'Malley is a fortunate man. We're simply attending a dance together, Mrs. Wilson," Penelope demurred, though she couldn't help the flush of pleasure that warmed her cheeks. "MMM." Mrs. Wilson's knowing look suggested she didn't believe that for a moment. "Well, enjoy yourselves. The miners' socials can be quite spirited." Preston arrived precisely at 7, looking so handsome in his dark suit that Penelope momentarily lost her composure. His usual working clothes, practical denims and flannel, had been replaced by well-tailored trousers and a jacket that accentuated his broad shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd clearly taken special care with his appearance. "Miss Lawson," he said, his eyes warming as they took her in. "You look beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You're quite handsome yourself." He offered his arm, and she took it, hyper-aware of the strength she could feel beneath the fine fabric of his sleeve. They walked toward his buggy, a well-maintained vehicle with gleaming brass fixtures and a matched pair of bays in the traces. "I wanted to thank you for the book," she said as he helped her into the seat. "It was a thoughtful gift." "Did you find anything worth reading?" he asked, climbing in beside her and taking up the reins. "Several passages. Wordsworth has a way of seeing beauty in the ordinary that I've always admired." Preston nodded, guiding the horses toward town. "My father was the literary one in the family. Always had his nose in a book when he wasn't working the ranch. My mother used to joke that he loved his library almost as much as he loved her." "And you? Do you share his love of reading?" "Not to the same degree. I enjoy a good book on a winter evening, but I'm more at home under the open sky than between pages." He glanced at her. "Though I'm developing a new appreciation for the written word, now that I've met a woman who clearly values it so highly." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. They continued the journey in comfortable conversation, Preston pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. By the time they reached the miners' hall, a large, barn-like structure on the edge of town, Penelope had relaxed considerably, almost forgetting the cloud of superstition that had followed her to Pioche. That illusion was shattered as they entered the hall. The music and chatter dimmed noticeably as heads turned toward them. Penelope felt the weight of dozens of stares, some curious, some hostile, and instinctively drew closer to Preston. He seemed to sense her discomfort, placing a reassuring hand at the small of her back as he guided her into the room. "Don't mind them," he murmured close to her ear. "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." The hall was decorated with paper lanterns and bunting, transformed from its usual utilitarian purpose into a festive space. A small band played in one corner, and couples were already spinning across the wooden floor in time to a lively reel. Several of Penelope's students ran up to greet her, their excitement at seeing their teacher outside of school overcoming any reservations their parents might have had. Their innocent enthusiasm eased the tension somewhat, and by the time Preston led her to the refreshment table, the stares had become less obvious, if not entirely absent. "Miss Lawson, Mr. O'Malley," Edwin Barker approached, his wife on his arm. "So pleased you could join us tonight." "Wouldn't miss it," Preston replied easily. "Best social event in the county, or so I've been told." Mrs. Barker, a plump woman with kind eyes, addressed Penelope directly. "I've been meaning to tell you, Miss Lawson, how impressed I am with little Samantha's progress. She's never shown such interest in her studies before." "Samantha has a natural curiosity," Penelope replied, touched by the woman's friendliness. "I simply try to nurture it." The exchange was interrupted by the band striking up a waltz. Preston turned to her with raised eyebrows. "Shall we?" This time, Penelope didn't hesitate, placing her hand in his and allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. Other couples made space for them, and then they were moving in perfect synchronization, as if they had danced together for years rather than once before. "You're still light on your feet for a cowboy," she teased, feeling a rush of happiness as they turned gracefully around the floor. "And you're still a natural dancer for a schoolteacher," he returned, his eyes never leaving hers. "Though I'm beginning to think there's nothing you can't do well once you set your mind to it." They danced 3 consecutive dances before taking a break for refreshments, and Penelope was delighted to find that each time they returned to the floor, more people greeted her with smiles or nods. The ice was thawing, slowly but surely. It was during their 4th dance, another waltz, that Preston drew her slightly closer than propriety strictly allowed. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said softly. "Seeing you smile like this, it's worth every raised eyebrow in the room." "I'm glad too," she admitted. "I'd forgotten what it feels like to simply enjoy an evening without looking over my shoulder for whispers." "There are still whispers," he acknowledged, "but they'll fade in time. People just need to know the real Penelope Lawson, not the legend they've created." "And you think you know the real me?" she asked, only half joking. His expression turned serious. "I'm learning. I know you're intelligent, kind, and braver than most men I've met. I know you care deeply about your students and take pride in your work. I know you've faced tragedy without letting it break you." His voice dropped lower. "And I know I've never met anyone like you, Penelope Lawson." The intensity in his gaze made her heart race. They had stopped dancing, though the music continued around them, creating a private moment in the midst of the crowded hall. "Preston," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, only that something significant was happening between them. Before she could continue, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Harley Jensen and his cronies had arrived, already visibly intoxicated and looking for trouble. "Well, look at this fancy gathering," Harley announced loudly. "And the cursed couple, right in the middle of it all." Preston's arm tightened protectively around Penelope's waist. "Harley, you're not welcome here. This is a respectable event." "Respectable?" Harley spat on the floor. "With her here? Do these good folks know what happens to men who get too close to Penelope Lawson?" The hall had gone silent, all eyes moving between Harley, Preston, and Penelope, who stood frozen in humiliation and anger. "That's enough." Edwin Barker stepped forward, surprisingly authoritative for his slight stature. "Mr. Jensen, you and your friends need to leave. Now." "Or what, schoolmaster?" Harley sneered. "You'll give me lines to write." Several minors moved to stand behind Barker, their expressions grim. "Or we'll throw you out," said one, a burly man with massive forearms. "The lady's done nothing to deserve your slander." Harley looked around, apparently surprised by the show of support for Penelope. His gaze hardened as it fell on Preston. "You've got them all fooled, don't you, O'Malley? But when they find you cold in your bed one morning, they'll remember I warned them." Preston moved forward, but Penelope caught his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "It's not worth it." To her relief, he hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. He's not worth the effort." The miners closed ranks around Harley and his friends, firmly escorting them outside despite their protests. When they returned, the band struck up another tune, trying to recapture the festive mood, but for Penelope, the evening had been irreparably tarnished. "I think I should go," she said quietly to Preston. "I'm just causing trouble." "You're not causing anything," he insisted. "Harley Jensen is a miserable drunk who likes to stir up problems. No one's blaming you." She glanced around the room, noting the whispers, the speculative glances. "Maybe not openly, but they're wondering, and I can't blame them. 3 men, Preston. 3 men who cared for me, all dead before their time. Even I sometimes wonder if there's something to the rumors." He took her hands in his expression fierce. "There isn't. You're not cursed, Penelope. You've been unlucky, tragically so, but that doesn't make you responsible for what happened to them." She wanted desperately to believe him. "What if you're wrong? What if there is something to it? I couldn't bear it if," she broke off, unable to complete the thought. "If something happened to me." He finished gently. "Nothing's going to happen. You can't know that." "No one can know that," he countered. "Life out here is uncertain. Miners die in cave-ins, ranchers get thrown from horses, children take fever. None of it has anything to do with curses." His practical assessment should have been comforting, but Penelope couldn't shake the deep-seated fear that had taken root over the years. "I think I still want to go," she said finally. "I'm sorry to cut the evening short." Preston nodded, disappointment evident in his eyes but respecting her wishes. "I'll take you home." The ride back to the boarding house was quiet, a stark contrast to their animated conversation on the way to the dance. Penelope stared at the stars overhead, trying to sort through the tumult of her emotions. She was drawn to Preston in a way she hadn't felt since Thomas, perhaps even more strongly. But the thought of caring for someone again, only to lose them, was almost unbearable. When they reached the boarding house, Preston helped her down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist. "Penelope," he began, "I want you to know that nothing that happened tonight changes how I feel." She looked up at him, moonlight silvering his features. "And how is that exactly?" "I'm falling for you," he said simply. "Have been since I first saw you step off that stagecoach with your chin held high despite the whispers." Her heart seemed to stop, then race forward. "Preston, you don't have to say anything," he assured her. "I know you're afraid. I'm just asking for a chance to show you that life is still worth living fully, risks and all." She thought of all the reasons to refuse him, the rumors, the tragedies that seemed to follow her, the comfort of isolation she had constructed around herself like armor. But standing there in the moonlight with his earnest gaze fixed on hers, those reasons seemed to fade in importance. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "but not just of some superstitious curse. I'm afraid of caring too much, of letting someone in only to lose them again." "That's a risk we all take," he replied softly. "Every time we open our hearts, the alternative is to never feel anything at all." The truth of his words resonated deeply. Penelope had been existing, not living, for too long. "I'm not asking for promises," Preston continued. "Just time. Time to get to know each other better, to see where this might lead." It was reasonable, measured, and terrifying in its potential. But as she looked at him, Penelope realized she wanted that chance, wanted to believe that her future could hold more than solitary safety. "Time," she agreed finally. "I think I can manage that." His smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "That's all I ask." He took her hand and with old-fashioned courtesy pressed his lips to her knuckles. "Good night, Penelope." "Good night, Preston." As she watched him drive away, Penelope felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, fragile but persistent, taking root in her heart. The weeks that followed saw Penelope and Preston navigating the delicate early stages of courtship under the watchful eyes of the Pioche community. True to his word, Preston didn't rush her, seemingly content with small moments of connection, walks after school, occasional dinners at the town's modest restaurant, Sunday afternoons reading together on the boarding house porch, while Mrs. Wilson pretended not to watch approvingly from the window. October arrived, bringing with it the first crisp hints of autumn to the Nevada highlands. The aspens in the mountains turned golden, and the mornings dawned with frost that melted by mid-morning. Penelope's class had grown to 18 students, and she had fully settled into her role as Pioche's schoolteacher. More significantly, the whispers about her curse had diminished, replaced by more ordinary gossip about her relationship with Preston O'Malley. That Preston remained hale and hearty despite spending time with her seemed to be eroding the superstition, at least among the more rational townspeople. It was on a particularly beautiful Saturday in mid-October that Preston invited Penelope for a picnic in the hills above his ranch. "The view is spectacular this time of year," he told her, "and I want to show you my father's favorite spot before winter sets in." Penelope had accepted eagerly, looking forward to escaping the confines of town for a day. Preston picked her up early, the morning air still crisp enough to justify the woolen shawl she wrapped around her shoulders as they set off in his buggy. "You're in high spirits today," she observed as he whistled a jaunty tune, guiding the horses along the mountain road. "It's a perfect day," he replied, grinning. "Good company, beautiful weather," and he patted a basket behind the seat, Mrs. Rodriguez's fried chicken. What more could a man ask for? His enthusiasm was infectious, and Penelope found herself smiling more freely than she had in years. The past weeks with Preston had awakened something in her she had thought permanently deadened by grief, the ability to look forward rather than back, to anticipate joy rather than dread loss. They climbed steadily higher into the mountains, the track narrowing until Preston finally stopped in a small clearing ringed by aspen trees, their golden leaves shimmering in the sunlight. "We'll have to walk from here," he said, helping her down. "It's not far, just over that rise." He gathered the picnic basket and a blanket, then offered her his arm. Together they hiked up a gentle slope, the only sounds their footsteps on the rocky trail and the whisper of aspen leaves in the breeze. When they crested the rise, Penelope gasped. Before them lay a panoramic view of the entire valley. Preston's ranch spread out below, the town of Pioche in the distance, and beyond, the vast expanse of the Nevada desert stretching toward the horizon, painted in shades of ochre and bronze in the autumn light. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, transfixed by the vista. "My father used to bring me here when I was a boy," Preston said, his voice soft with memory. "He'd point out the boundaries of our land and tell me, 'Remember, son, we don't really own any of this. We're just borrowing it from God and the future generations.' He sounds like a wise man." He was. Preston spread the blanket beneath a particularly magnificent aspen. "I wish you could have known him. He would have liked you, a woman of intelligence and substance." They settled on the blanket, and Preston unpacked the picnic fried chicken, corn bread, apple pie, and a bottle of apple cider. They ate in companionable silence for a while, savoring the food and the spectacular view. "I've been thinking," Preston said eventually, "about what you said that night after the dance about being afraid to care too much." Penelope set down her cup of cider, suddenly alert to the serious turn in conversation. "Yes, I understand fear, Penelope. After my father died, I was terrified of losing anyone else I cared about. My mother had passed years earlier, and when he went too, I felt untethered, like the last thing holding me to the earth had been cut." She nodded, recognizing the feeling all too well. "What changed?" "Time, partly. And realizing that living in fear was honoring neither of them. My parents loved life, they embraced it with everything they had. To shrink from living because I was afraid of more pain seemed a poor way to honor their memory." His words struck a chord deep within her. Hadn't she been doing exactly that, shrinking from life, allowing fear to dictate her choices? "I'm trying," she said softly, "to be brave, to open myself to possibilities again, but sometimes the fear is overwhelming." Preston reached across the blanket, taking her hand in his. "I know. And I don't mean to push you faster than you're ready to go. I just want you to know that whatever happens between us, I believe taking the risk is worth it." The sincerity in his eyes made her breath catch. Impulsively, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his a brief, sweet kiss that nonetheless sent warmth flooding through her. When she pulled back, Preston looked momentarily stunned, then broke into a slow smile that made her heart flutter. "If that's your idea of taking a risk, Miss Lawson, I wholeheartedly approve," she laughed, suddenly feeling lighter than she had in years. "It's a start, Mr. O'Malley." He brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, his touch gentle. "A very good start." The afternoon passed in a haze of shared stories, laughter, and a few more tentative kisses as the boundaries between them softened. By the time they packed up the picnic and headed back down the mountain, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship, a corner turned toward deeper connection. Neither of them noticed the storm clouds gathering on the horizon until they were halfway back to town. The sky darkened rapidly, and the wind picked up, sending dried leaves skittering across the road ahead of them. "We'd better hurry," Preston said, urging the horses to a faster pace. "Autumn storms can come on quick in these mountains," but the storm moved faster than they could. They were still a mile from town when the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, quickly intensifying into a deluge. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder that spooked the horses. Preston fought to control the suddenly panicked animals as they reared and tried to bolt. "Steady," he called, his knuckles white on the reins. "Easy now." Another flash and crack, and the horses lunged forward, the buggy lurching violently. Penelope clutched the seat as they careened down the muddy road, Preston straining to regain control. "Hold on," he shouted above the storm, his face grim with concentration. A fallen branch appeared suddenly in the road ahead. The horses swerved to avoid it, sending the buggy tilting dangerously on two wheels. Penelope felt herself sliding, then falling as the vehicle tipped further, finally toppling onto its side with a splintering crash. She hit the ground hard, mud and rain soaking her instantly as she lay stunned for a moment. The horses, freed from their traces by the impact, galloped away down the road, leaving the overturned buggy and its occupants behind. "Preston," she called, struggling to her feet. "Preston, are you all right?" There was no answer. Panic rising in her throat, Penelope stumbled around the wrecked buggy to find Preston lying motionless on the ground, a gash on his forehead bleeding freely, mixing with the rain that continued to pour down. "No," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. "No, no, no, Preston, wake up. Please wake up." She pressed trembling fingers to his neck and nearly collapsed with relief when she felt a strong pulse. He was alive, just unconscious from the blow to his head. But they were a mile from town in a raging storm, with no transportation and Preston unable to walk. Penelope looked around desperately, trying to formulate a plan through her rising fear. The nearest shelter was the Peterson farm about a quarter-mile back up the road, but she couldn't carry Preston that far. "Preston," she tried again, patting his face gently. "Please, I need you to wake up." His eyelids fluttered, then opened, confusion clouding his gaze. "Penelope, what?" "The buggy overturned," she explained quickly. "You hit your head. Can you sit up?" he tried, wincing with pain. "Give me a minute." "We need to find shelter," she insisted, the rain still hammering down around them. "The Peterson farm isn't far if you can walk with my help." Preston nodded grimly, then immediately regretted the motion. With Penelope's assistance, he managed to get to his feet, swaying slightly as he found his balance. "Lean on me," she instructed, putting his arm around her shoulders despite their height difference. Together they began the arduous journey through the mud and rain, Preston growing heavier against her with each step. Twice he stumbled, nearly taking them both down, but Penelope's determination kept them moving forward. By the time they reached the Peterson farmhouse, they were both soaked to the skin and shivering. Preston's face had grown alarmingly pale, and the blood from his wound had spread across his forehead and down one cheek. Old Mrs. Peterson opened the door to Penelope's frantic knocking, her eyes widening at the sight of them. "Good heavens, what happened?" "Buggy accident," Penelope explained through chattering teeth. "Mr. O'Malley's injured. Please, can we come in?" Of course, of course." The elderly woman ushered them inside, calling for her son. "John, come quick. We've got hurt folks here." What followed was a blur of activity as Preston was helped to a cot by the fire, his wound cleaned and bandaged by Mrs. Peterson, while her son John stoked the flames higher to warm the chilled pair. Penelope was given a blanket and a cup of hot tea, which she could barely hold with her trembling hands. "That's a nasty cut," Mrs. Peterson said, examining Preston's forehead. "Might need stitches, but it's too late to fetch the doctor now. We'll send John at first light if the storm's passed." "Thank you," Preston murmured, his voice weak but coherent. "Sorry to impose." "Nonsense," the old woman replied briskly. "Can't have folks dying in a ditch on my property." "Bad for business." Her dry humor elicited a small smile from Preston before his eyes sought Penelope. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, moving closer to his side. "Just worried about you." "Takes more than a little tumble to keep me down," he said, though his pallor belied the bravado. Mrs. Peterson checked his pupils, nodding with satisfaction. "No concussion, I think, but you'll have a headache to remember. Best get some rest now. John will see to your horses they turned up at the miller's place down the road." She shooed John out to prepare the guest room for Penelope, leaving the couple alone by the fire. As soon as they had privacy, Penelope took Preston's hand in both of hers, her composure finally cracking. "I thought," her voice broke. "When I saw you lying there not moving, I thought, I know." He squeezed her hand weakly. "But I'm fine, just a knock on the head." "It could have been worse," she whispered, the fear that had been her constant companion for years resurfacing with a vengeance. "So much worse." Preston's gaze was steady despite his pain. "But it wasn't. I'm here, Penelope." "Still very much alive." She nodded, unable to articulate the storm of emotions swirling within her, relief warring with terror, joy with the certainty that she had tempted fate by opening her heart again. "This isn't your fault," Preston said softly, reading her thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "It was an accident. A branch in the road spooked horses. Nothing to do with curses or bad luck." "I know that rationally," she admitted. "But the fear isn't rational, Preston. It's bone deep." He tugged gently on her hand until she moved closer, then reached up to touch her cheek. "Then we'll just have to keep proving it wrong, won't we? Day by day, until the fear loses its power." The simple confidence in his voice steadied her, and Penelope found herself nodding. "Day by day," she echoed, making it a promise, Mrs. Peterson returned then to show Penelope to her room, insisting that both travelers get a good night's rest. But long after the household had settled into silence, Penelope lay awake, listening to the storm gradually subside and contemplating the man sleeping down the hall, a man who refused to believe in curses, who had looked at her fear and met it with unwavering faith. "Day by day," he had said. A path forward, one step at a time. For the first time in years, Penelope allowed herself to imagine a future untainted by dread, a future with Preston O'Malley at its center. Preston's injury, while not life-threatening, required several days of rest, during which Penelope divided her time between teaching and visiting the Peterson farm to check on his recovery. By the fourth day, he was well enough to return to his ranch, though the doctor from Pioche had ordered him to avoid strenuous activity for at least a week. The accident, far from reinforcing the superstitions about Penelope, seemed to have the opposite effect. The Petersons' matter-of-fact kindness and Preston's quick recovery undercut the notion of a curse. More significantly, Penelope's obvious devotion during Preston's convalescence endeared her to many in the community who had previously kept their distance. "You know, Mrs. Wilson remarked one evening as Penelope prepared to visit Preston with a basket of home-baked goods, "I haven't seen that man look so happy in all the years he's been running that ranch. Injury and all." Penelope smiled, adjusting the cloth covering the still warm apple pie. "He's a remarkable man. Patient and kind, even when I'm being difficult." Mrs. Wilson gave her a knowing look. "Sounds like love to me." The word hung in the air between them, a word Penelope had carefully avoided even in her own thoughts. But as she made her way to the O'Malley ranch that evening, she couldn't deny the truth of it. Somewhere along the way, her cautious affection for Preston had deepened into something much more profound. She found him on the porch of his ranch house, a book open in his lap, though his gaze was fixed on the mountains in the distance. He smiled broadly when he saw her approach, setting the book aside and standing to greet her. "You're looking better," she observed, noting with relief that the color had returned to his face, though a healing cut still marked his forehead. "Feel better," he confirmed, taking the basket from her. "Doc says I can get back to normal work next week, just in time for the fall roundup." "Don't push yourself too hard," she cautioned, following him inside to the cozy main room of the ranch house. It was her first visit to his home, and she looked around with interest at the comfortable furnishings, a mixture of practical ranch items and more refined pieces that must have belonged to his parents. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with the volumes he had mentioned inheriting from his father. "It's lovely," she said, genuinely impressed. "It feels like a real home." "It is," he replied simply. "Or it was when my parents were alive. Been a bit lonely since then, if I'm honest." The admission touched her. "I understand that feeling all too well." He set the basket on the dining table and turned to her, his expression suddenly serious. "Penelope, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about, something important." Her heart quickened. "Oh." That day on the mountain, before the accident, it was one of the happiest days I've had in years. And when I woke up after the crash and saw your face, terrified but determined, I realized something. He took her hands in his gaze steady and sure. "I love you, Penelope Lawson. I think I have since that first day in the schoolhouse, when you invited me to stay for your geography lesson." The words she had both longed for and dreaded hung in the air between them. Penelope felt tears spring to her eyes, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion she saw in his face. "Preston," she began, her voice unsteady. You don't have to say it back," he interrupted gently. "I know you're still afraid, and that's all right. I just needed you to know how I feel." But in that moment, with his hands warm around hers and his eyes full of a love she had never expected to find again, the fear that had been her constant companion seemed suddenly less powerful than what she felt for this man. "I love you too," she whispered, the words like a dam breaking. "So much that it terrifies me." Joy bloomed across his face, transforming it. "Penelope, let me finish," she said, needing him to understand. "I've been holding back, trying to protect both of us from what I've convinced myself will happen. But these past weeks with you, especially since the accident, I've realized that I'm more afraid of not loving you than of whatever might come of loving you." It was the truth, she realized as she said it. The weeks since the buggy accident had shown her that no amount of caution could prevent life's uncertainties. But choosing not to love that was a guarantee of emptiness she could no longer accept. Preston released her hands only to cup her face gently between his palms. "Then we face whatever comes together," he said simply, and bent to kiss her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they parted, Penelope felt lighter somehow, as if a burden she had carried for years had finally been set down. "Together," she agreed, sealing it with another kiss. They spent the evening talking of the future, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Preston spoke of expanding the ranch, of the new breeding stock he wanted to acquire. Penelope shared her hopes for the school, her dreams of building a proper library for the town's children. As the evening waned, Preston walked her to the door, reluctant to see her go but mindful of propriety. "I'll come into town tomorrow," he promised. "Perhaps we could have dinner at the hotel. I'd like that." She smiled up at him, marveling at how much had changed in just a few hours. The fear wasn't gone entirely. She doubted it ever would be, but it had been replaced as the dominant force in her heart. Love had taken its rightful place. As winter settled over Pioche, bringing snow to the mountains and quiet evenings by the fire, Penelope and Preston's courtship became the talk of the town, not as a cautionary tale of superstition, but as a romance that had blossomed despite adversity. The story of the cursed schoolteacher and the cowboy who took his chances became something of a local legend, though now often told with a smile rather than in hushed, fearful tones. By Christmas, Preston was a regular visitor to Penelope's classroom, captivating the students with tales of ranch life or demonstrations of rope tricks. The children adored him, and Penelope found herself imagining with increasing frequency what kind of father he would be to children of their own. The thought no longer filled her with dread, but with a cautious hope that grew stronger with each passing day. It was on Christmas Eve, during the town's annual celebration at the church, that Preston finally made his intentions formal. The entire community had gathered for carols and refreshments, the modest building festooned with pine boughs and candles that cast a warm glow over the proceedings. Penelope, wearing a festive red dress she had secretly sewn over the previous weeks, was helping serve hot cider when Preston appeared at her side, unusually nervous. "Could I speak with you outside for a moment?" he asked quietly. Curious, she followed him onto the church steps, where the clear winter night spread a canopy of stars overhead and their breath formed clouds in the frosty air. Preston took both her hands in his expression more serious than she had seen it in weeks. "Penelope, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light back into a world that had grown dim for me." Her heart began to race as she realized where this was leading. "Preston, please, let me say this." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know you still have moments of doubt, moments when the old fears resurface. But I've watched you face those fears with more courage than anyone I've ever known. You've taught me what real bravery looks like." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small box. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. But I realize now there will never be a perfect time, only the time we make perfect by choosing each other, day after day." Opening the box, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds, elegant, understated, and perfectly suited to her. "Penelope Lawson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes, "would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Time seemed to suspend as Penelope looked from the ring to the face of the man she had come to love more deeply than she had thought possible. All the reasons to say no, the fear, the superstition, the painful memories of past losses rose up briefly, then receded before the certainty that had grown in her over the months of knowing Preston. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yes, I will marry you, Preston O'Malley." Joy transformed his features as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the ground. When he set her down, they were both laughing, breathless with happiness. "Are you sure?" he asked, suddenly serious again. "Absolutely sure. Because I don't want you to have a moment's regret." "I'm sure," she replied, touching his face tenderly. "The only thing I would regret is letting fear rob us of the chance to build a life together." The church door opened behind them, spilling light and the sound of carols onto the steps. Mrs. Wilson stood there, a knowing smile on her face as she took in the scene before her. "Well," she said, "are you two going to stand out here all night, or are you coming in to share your news? The whole town's waiting." Penelope looked at Preston in surprise. "The whole town?" He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I might have mentioned my intentions to a few people. Word travels fast in Pioche." "A few people," Mrs. Wilson snorted. "He asked half the town for advice on the ring and the other half for their blessing. There isn't a soul in Pioche who doesn't know Preston O'Malley is head over heels for you, Miss Lawson." Laughing, Penelope took Preston's arm. "Well then, I suppose we shouldn't keep them waiting." As they re-entered the church to a chorus of cheers and well wishes, Penelope was struck by how completely her life had transformed in the few months since she had arrived in Pioche. The wary, solitary woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, braced for whispers and judgment, was now surrounded by friends, embraced by community, and loved by a man who had never once believed she was anything but extraordinary. The wedding was set for the first day of spring, March 20, 1874, a symbolic choice that appealed to both Penelope and Preston. The winter months passed in a flurry of preparations, with the entire town seeming to rally around the couple. Mrs. Wilson and her daughter Caroline helped Penelope sew a wedding dress of cream-colored silk, while Preston's ranch hands pitched in to expand and renovate the ranch house, adding a larger kitchen and a dedicated library space that would become Penelope's sanctuary. As the date approached, Penelope found the old fears surfacing occasionally, usually in the dark hours of the night when doubts seemed to grow stronger. But each time, she confronted them head-on, refusing to let superstition dictate her future. The day before the wedding, she visited the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, laying wildflowers on the graves of strangers but thinking of the men she had loved and lost. It was a private farewell to the guilt and fear she had carried for so long, a silent promise to honor their memories by embracing the life that lay before her rather than dwelling in the shadows of the past. As she turned to leave, she found Preston waiting at the cemetery gate, respectfully keeping his distance but offering his presence as silent support. "How did you know I would be here?" she asked as she joined him. "Because I know you," he replied simply. "And I know you needed to make peace before tomorrow." She slipped her hand into his, grateful beyond words for his understanding. "I have, or I'm trying to, at least. It's a process. Most important things are." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Any regrets about tomorrow?" "Not one," she assured him. "Just the usual bride's nerves, I suppose." He smiled, relief evident in his eyes. "Good, because I've never been more certain of anything in my life." The wedding day dawned clear and mild, the first real spring day after the long Nevada winter. The entire town of Pioche seemed to have turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity and spilling out onto the street outside. As Penelope stood at the back of the church, her arm linked through Edwin Barker's, who had tearfully accepted her request to give her away, she felt a profound sense of rightness, of having come full circle from loss to renewal. The music began. Caroline Wilson at the organ, playing the traditional wedding march, and the congregation rose, turning to watch as Penelope began her journey toward the altar where Preston waited, his face alight with joy and love. Step by step, She moved forward, each footfall carrying her further from the woman she had been, isolated by fear, defined by tragedy, and closer to the woman she was choosing to become. Preston O'Malley's wife, a beloved teacher, a valued member of this community that had, against all odds, become home. When she reached Preston's side and placed her hand in his, the last lingering shadows of doubt disappeared, burned away by the warmth of his smile and the absolute certainty in his eyes. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Preston O'Malley and Penelope Lawson in holy matrimony." The words washed over Penelope as she stood facing the man who had refused to believe she was cursed, who had looked beyond rumor and superstition to see the woman beneath. The man who had said, simply and without reservation, "Then I'll take my chances," and in doing so had changed both their lives immeasurably. When it came time for the vows, Preston's voice was steady and sure, his promises made not just for the good times but explicitly for the challenges they would undoubtedly face. Penelope's voice trembled slightly as she began her own vows, but grew stronger with each word, her commitment clear to all who listened. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared at last. "You may kiss the bride." As Preston's lips met hers, sealing their union before God and community, Penelope felt a sense of homecoming so profound it brought tears to her eyes. They had found each other against all odds, had chosen love over fear, faith over superstition. The celebration that followed at the O'Malley Ranch lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and more goodwill than Penelope had thought possible when she first arrived in Pioche. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the land, Preston led her away from the festivities to the bluff where they had shared their first kiss months before. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over what was now their home, their future. "Completely," she assured him, leaning into his embrace. "I never thought I could be this happy again." "This is just the beginning," he promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We have a lifetime ahead of us, Mrs. O'Malley." The name, her new name, sent a thrill through her. "A lifetime," she echoed, savoring the word and all it promised. "I like the sound of that." As they stood there, silhouetted against the sunset, Penelope thought of all the twists of fate that had brought her to this moment, some painful, some joyful, all necessary parts of the journey. The losses she had endured would always be part of her story, but they were no longer its defining chapter. She had arrived in Pioche as the cursed woman, the bearer of bad luck. She would continue her life there as Penelope O'Malley, teacher, wife, and living proof that love, when given a chance, could overcome even the most persistent of fears. Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Preston's arms around her and his heartbeat strong beneath her cheek, Penelope made a silent vow: to live each day fully, to love without reservation, and to never again allow fear to dictate her choices. "What are you thinking?" Preston murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. She smiled in the darkness. "That I'm glad you took your chances on me." His arms tightened around her. "Best risk I ever took," he replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "And one I take again, every day for the rest of my life." As she drifted toward sleep, secure in her husband's embrace, Penelope realized that the whispers that had followed her to Pioche had finally been silenced not by time or forgetfulness, but by the undeniable evidence of a love that had flourished despite them. They had said she was bad luck to love. Preston had said he'd take his chances. And in doing so, he had rewritten both their stories, turning superstition into a footnote in a much larger, richer tale of love found, fears conquered, and a life built together, day by day, choice by choice, chance by chance. 5 years later, on another perfect spring day, Penelope sat on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching Preston teaching their 3-year-old son Thomas to ride his first pony. Their daughter Elizabeth, just 1 year old, played at Penelope's feet, occasionally looking up to offer a drooly smile that melted her mother's heart. The O'Malley Ranch had prospered under Preston's careful management, becoming one of the most successful operations in eastern Nevada. Penelope still taught at the Pioche school, though she had taken a brief respite after each child's birth. The town had grown considerably, with a new schoolhouse built just the previous year, large enough to accommodate Pioche's expanding population. The old whispers about curses and bad luck had long since faded into vague memory, replaced by stories of the schoolteacher and the rancher whose love had defied superstition. Occasionally, newcomers to town would hear some version of the tale, usually embellished for dramatic effect, but they need only look at the thriving O'Malley family to see its happy conclusion. As Preston hoisted little Thomas higher in the saddle, the boy's delighted laughter carrying across the yard, Penelope felt the familiar swell of gratitude that had become her daily companion. For the life they had built together, for the children they had been blessed with, for the love that had given her the courage to begin again when all had seemed lost. Preston looked up, catching her watching them, and his face broke into the smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. He said something to Thomas, then led the pony toward the porch where Penelope and Elizabeth waited. "Mama, did you see?" Thomas called excitedly. "I'm riding like Papa, I saw, sweetheart," she replied, smiling at her son's flushed face. "You're a natural, just like your father." Preston lifted the boy from the saddle and set him on the porch steps. "Go wash up for dinner, partner. Tell Caroline we'll be right in." As Thomas dashed inside to find their housekeeper, Preston sat beside Penelope, gathering Elizabeth into his arms. The little girl immediately grabbed for his mustache, a favorite game that made him wince and laugh simultaneously. "You looked deep in thought just now," he observed, bouncing their daughter on his knee. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. O'Malley." Penelope leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing through her. "I was thinking about chances," she said softly, "about how different our lives might have been if you hadn't been brave enough to take one on me." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Best decision I ever made. Though I maintain it wasn't bravery so much as common sense. Only a fool would have let you get away." She laughed, still moved by his unwavering faith after all these years. "Well, then I'm grateful for your common sense, Mr. O'Malley." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber reminiscent of that first sunset when Penelope had arrived in Pioche. "You ever think about them?" Preston asked quietly. "The men from before." It wasn't a question born of jealousy. They had moved well beyond such insecurities, but of genuine care for her emotional well-being. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Less often now. I still visit their graves in my thoughts on occasion, especially since we named Thomas. But it's different now. I remember them with fondness rather than guilt." He nodded, understanding as always. "They'd be happy for you, I think, for the life you've built." "I think so too," she agreed. Then with a smile, "Though they might be surprised to see me with 4 horses, 2 children, and a cattle baron for a husband." Preston laughed, the sound joining with Elizabeth's delighted giggles as he tickled her gently. "Life is full of surprises. Thank God for that." As they gathered their daughter and headed inside to join their son for dinner, Penelope paused in the doorway. taking one last look at the land that had become her home, the life that had exceeded her wildest hopes. They had said she was bad luck to love. But luck, Penelope had learned, was not some capricious force beyond human control. It was a choice, the choice to see possibility rather than limitation, to embrace joy rather than fear, to take chances on love even when past experience counseled caution. Preston had made that choice the day she arrived in Pioche, and in doing so had shown her how to make it too. Day by day, chance by chance, they had built a life together that defied superstition and rewrote both their stories. And as she closed the door behind her, joining her family at the table filled with laughter and love, Penelope O'Malley knew with absolute certainty that she would take that chance again, every day, for all the days to come.